Hello and welcome back. I'm Desmond Annabrandt, Grant Programs Manager here at Southeastern Minnesota Arts Council. In the previous video, we focused on the project narrative and looked at examples of successful applications to better understand what reviewers are looking for. In this video, we'll be focusing on the spending plan or the budget section and how we could use a tool like SEMAC's Spending Plan Worksheet to prepare for the budget section of your application. Many applicants find the budget intimidating, but its purpose is actually quite simple. You're helping reviewers understand what your project will cost and how you arrived at those numbers. Keep in mind that in this instance, a strong budget is usually not the most complicated budget. It's the one that's easiest to understand. So, without further ado, let's switch our budgeting brain on and let's jump right to it. Alrighty, we have a lot to cover today, so I am going to go right into the application form and we will be looking at the spending plan. Okay, so before we begin looking at the spending plan, I'd like to mention one of the most common mistakes applicants make. Sometimes applicants build their budget in isolation from the rest of the application. Remember, the spending plan isn't a separate exercise. It's the financial breakdown of the project you've already described. By the time reviewers reach your budget, they've already read about your project activities, timeline, public engagement, collaborators, and goals, right? They're expecting to see those same activities reflected in financial terms. As you prepare your budget, ask yourself one simple question. Can I point out to where this expense appears in the story of my project? If the answer is no, reviewers may have difficulty understanding why the expense is necessary. Likewise, if you've described major project activities but don't include the expenses needed to accomplish them, reviewers may be left wondering how those parts of the project will happen. Think of the spending plan as another way of telling the story of your project, but this time through numbers, resources, and expenses. Okay? So let's take a quick look at the spending plan itself before we begin preparing our budget. The first question asks you to select the budget categories that apply to your project. These categories represent all of the proposed expenses for your project, even if some of those expenses will be paid out of pocket or by another funding source. In other words, this section should reflect the total cost of your project, not just the amount you're requesting from SEMAC. Once you select the category, the corresponding budget section will appear below. Let me give you an example. So if we were to choose artistic fees, honoraria, and stipends, it will pop up over here. See? It's like a branching question. Well, it is actually a branching question, just like how I showed you earlier in the previous videos. So once you select the category, it will show it will show down below, but keep this in mind because if you later decide that a category no longer applies to your project, simply return to this part and then uncheck the box, and then that part will disappear. So for this video, I will probably use everything except for rental and other expenses just because of how similar those are to the other fields. I'll still talk about it, but I just won't do anything to it. So I just want to quickly show you how the layout looks like. So basically you have a text box where you could put in the actual numbers, a bit of description, and the things in green are examples, so you could always refer to those. And then you will have a subtotal box below, which you would use to input all of the total numbers of the things you've included in the text box above. So yeah. Anyway, let's talk about. We'll talk more about that in the next video. But let's talk about the spending plan. So when you finish inputting all of the things in the budget sections, you'll get to the double check your spending plan section over here. And then the first thing you'll see here is a reminder. We'll use this reminder as an exercise in the next video or the final video. But basically, it's reminding you to complete the fields for the budget categories that apply to your proposed grant activity, round budget items to the nearest $5, list dollar figures on the left margin, place each budget item on a separate line, and double check for math errors. So yeah, we'll do that in the next video. But I want to talk a bit about total expenses and SEMAC grant requests first, because I feel that this is important for us to know before we start working on drafting up the budget numbers and description. So after completing the spending plan, you'll be asked to enter your total expenses and the SEMAC grant request. Keep in mind that your SEMAC grant request cannot exceed your total expenses. If all of your project expenses will be paid by the SEMAC grant, then your total expenses should match your SEMAC grant request number. Okay? However, if your total expenses are greater than your SEMAC grant request, you'll indicate whether some expenses will be paid with other funds or additional expenses will be paid out of pocket. And that will open a new section here called proposed use of funds. See, if I choose this one, that part will disappear. Okay, so in short, make sure that if all expenses will be paid by SEMAC, then total expenses and SEMAC grant request number should match. If expenses will be paid with other funds or out of pocket, then total expenses would be greater than the SEMAC grant request. But there are no scenarios where your SEMAC grant request is greater than total expenses. Okay, keep that in mind. We'll complete this section in the next video where we will transfer all numbers and description from the worksheet to the application form. Now that you have a general understanding of how the budget part is organized, let's talk a bit about that worksheet that I just mentioned. Okay, I'm going to pull in here an applicant journey. So the worksheet lives in the appendix of the applicant journey. I won't be talking about the applicant journey because we've talked about that in the first video. But yeah, we will be talking about the spending plan worksheet part of this applicant journey, and then again, it's in the appendix. Okay. Before we start to talk about the worksheet and what's in the worksheet, I want to just very quickly mention this, that using the worksheet is completely optional, but I highly recommend it. It will give you the flexibility to organize your ideas, to revise your calculations, and make changes before entering anything into the application form. When designing this worksheet, one of my goals was to condense the entire budget section into just a couple of pages. Rather than having applicants having to scroll up and scroll down to look at different budget sections, I was hoping that this could be a tool that lets you to look at the budget categories through a bird's eye view. I think that that would make the actual putting in the numbers in the budget section of the application form so much easier. I also designed this to be printed, and for those who prefer to sketch out ideas with pencil or a pen, make notes or cross things out or highlight things before entering it into the application form, this is definitely also for you. So whether you work digitally or on paper, the worksheet is here as your planning tool to help you prepare for the budget section. Okay, now let's start by talking a bit about what's in here. So I mentioned a bit about the grant up here, and then the function of this worksheet, and then you'll see the budget categories. These categories, artistic fees, cost of evaluation, etc., reflects the application form. And then you have the expenses section. You could use any part of this worksheet. And then the notes section, I normally use the notes part and also the part on the very left here. Anyway, you'll see later. And it goes all the way through all of the sections, and then total expenses, SEMAC grant requests, and then just additional notes of like the award amount, and then a bit about eligibility and all that we've talked about in the first video. Okay, so let us start with the first part here, artistic fees, honoraria, and stipends. So this category is used for payments to artists, culture bearers, performers, collaborators, or any other individuals contributing to the project. One question we receive from time to time is whether applicants can include an artist fee for themselves. And the answer is yes. In fact, artist fees are encouraged because reviewers understand that artists and culture bearers should be compensated for the time, labor, and expertise they contribute to the project. Okay, so let's look at an example. I'm going to pause the video real quick while I paste my example in here, and then we'll talk more about it. Okay. All right, so we are back. I've pasted the example here. This example is inspired by Lydia Hansen's version of answering to the artistic fees, honoraria, and stipends. I just changed some of the names, but structure-wise is the same. So let's look at the first one here is the artist fee. It's a 900, and it's from these 12 pieces of artwork. It gets multiplied by $75 for each of them, and that resulted in the 900 figure here. And then there's also an art handler labor for $50 per hour, 3 hours, $150. And then lodging, 200, artist fee, $150. Okay. And the total is $1,400. Okay, perfect. So notice how each line explains what the payment is for and how the amount was calculated. Some payments are calculated per artwork, others by the hour, and another identifies a flat lodging expense associated with the collaborator. The reason why I chose this as an example is because of that. It shows different kind of formatting, and I think it could be relevant for you depending on which kind of formatting you're planning to use in this budget section. In general, though, I think that a budget section should tell a story, and I feel that this tells enough of that story to help reviewer understand by the end of reviewing this section that there will be an artist fee for the artist, or there will be 12 artworks, there will be an art handler that would install and keep maintaining the artworks, and then there will be a performance arts, etc., etc. So it tells enough. It tells a story, and that's what's important. Is that each section tells a part of the story, but in general, the budget is it's relevant to the whole narrative and the information you've included before that narrative. So it's that storyline that you're trying to build. Okay, now let's move on to the next part, cost of evaluation. So every project is expected to evaluate its activities. And if your project includes expenses directly related to that evaluation, they should be listed here. Remember, though, that evaluation expenses cannot exceed 5% of your SEMAC grant request. Again, I'm going to pause the video, paste an example, and then we'll talk about it, okay? All right, we are back with this example over here. Let's review this together. So, $40 for 3-foot clear plastic tubes, $20 each for tallying trail usage data. Visitors are asked to add small stones provided at trailheads to tubes every time they visit. Plastic end caps for tubes, $5 each, total of $20. Metal fence posts 2,000 money tubes, $10. Tabulation of data 2 hours, $25 per hour, $50 with a total of 120. Okay, perfect. So this is a great example of an evaluation budget section. Because the applicant budgets for the evaluation process itself rather than simply writing evaluation and then a number. Reviewers can immediately understand what will be evaluated, how the information will be collected, and how the cost was calculated. If your project has evaluation related expenses, try to be just as specific. Okay? Now let's move on to the next one, equipment and non-expendable items. So this category is used for equipment that is necessary to complete your project and will continue to have value after the project has ended. Let's look at an example. I'm going to pause the video. I'll be right back with an example, okay? All right, I am back here with an example taken from Sujin Lee's application. If you remember when we were talking about narrative, I think, use one of Sujin's narrative in which she explains that she will use these 10 mini trial Gaiagium for workshop participants. So it's reflected here, and that's an example of how it should be like. So budgets should reflect what you've explained earlier in the application form, creating the storyline, and the budget itself should also tell a story, at least to contribute a part of its story in the whole storyline, if that makes sense. Anyway, in this project that Sujin was proposing in the application, she included this 10 mini trial Gaiagium, 10 instruments, 150 each, shipping and handling, import tax, etc., totaling that amount. So in this example, the equipment is being purchased for workshop participants to actively engage with the project itself. It's a great example of how equipment can directly support the public engagement activities you've described elsewhere in your application. Equipment doesn't always need to be purchased for participants, though. In other projects, it may remain with the artists. For an example, you could request for like a kiln in a ceramic project, or like a specialized camera in like a photography project. As long as the equipment clearly supports the proposed project, it may be appropriate to include it in this category. Okay. I hope that's clear enough. Let's move on to the next part, expendable supplies and materials. Okay. These are items that will be used during the project, such as art materials, workshop supplies, etc., etc. If you already have some of these materials on hand, you'll have an opportunity to identify them in a separate supplies on hand section, which we'll look into in the next video. For now, simply include items you're requesting grant funding for and save the materials you already own for that section, okay? So I'm going to pause the video again here and paste an example, and we'll get right back and review it together. This example was made by Lydia Hansen, and yeah, let's look at it together. So 2 banners, weather assistant banners, 140 each for 280, and then custom plastic signs, 12 signs, $35 each, and then posts, 12 posts, $5 each. It's a total of 760. Okay. So rather than grouping everything together under one large material expense, each supply in this example is listed separately with a clear calculation, right? This is pretty straightforward. This makes it easier for viewers to understand exactly what materials are needed, how many are being purchased, and how the total cost was determined. So again, please itemize your materials in the budget in a similar way instead of combining everything into one general expense. Okay, let's move on to the next one. in-state travel. So, all right. This category is used for travel that takes place within Minnesota. Remember, you cannot you cannot include any out of state travel. So this is specifically for travel that is within Minnesota. I am again going to pause the video and paste an example. We'll be right back. All right, we are back. And the reason why I brought up this example is because Lydia used this 0.72 per mile, and it reminded me about mileage and how we should calculate mileage, because that is another question that we get. So please know that in terms of mileage, I also recommend you to use the current IRS standard mileage rate. And you could go to, hang on, let me just put this aside. So you could Google just IRS mileage rate 2026. It changes every year, so make sure you check this out every year. So that's 72.5 cents per mile. So Lydia's answer to that section kind of reminded me that we have that IRS standard mileage rate, and I wanted to use this example so I could explain that a bit before we move on. So SEMAC generally recommends using this rate because it provides consistent and widely accepted method for estimating travel costs. So I just want to point that out, that that's out there and you could use that as your mileage. Moving on to publicity. So cost of publicity. Okay. This section includes expenses related to promoting your project, such as printed materials, advertisings, mailings, or other outreach activities. I've put together this fictional example because it demonstrates a wider range of publicity activities than our previous examples. So I'll be right back. All right, I am back with an example here. So I've listed different kind of publicities, Facebook and Instagram ads, $75, social media advertising campaign, and I should specify that's, let's just say $15 per week for 5 weeks. Okay, I think that goes up to 75. Let me just triple check. Yep. So it's always a good idea to make sure that you're telling the reviewer how you came up with the number. Again, I'm telling you this on and on again, but it's always important to think of it that way and put yourselves in the reviewer's perspective. So yeah, breaking publicity into individual items make it so much easier for reviewers to understand how the budget was developed and how each expenses will support each other. And one important reminder is that publicity activities funded through the grant cannot begin before your project's approved start date. Okay? So when you have an approved start date for a specific grant project, you cannot publicize anything related to that grant project before the start date. All right, so I'm just going to talk a bit about rental and other expenses, but I'm not going to include anything under them. And again, remember that you don't have to fill out all of the budget section, okay? You could choose whatever is relevant. And so, yeah, I'm going to talk about rental and other expenses, but I won't have any itemized budget under them. So, okay, if your project requires renting a venue, equipment, or specialized tools, make sure that those expenses are here. One important thing to remember is that fees paid to your public engagement venue cannot exceed 10% of your SEMAC grant request. So it's a good idea to review those expenses carefully before finalizing your budget. And then other expenses, basically, it's pretty straightforward. If an expense does not fit anywhere in the previous categories, it belongs here. However, keep in mind that applicants should review the guidelines carefully to make sure the expense is allowable, right? We've talked about this in the first video. So just keep that in mind. And so now that we have everything listed, all we have to do is just double check the numbers, make sure that the calculations are correct. Remember, if you miscalculate your number, your application will be put back to draft. You will be notified via email, and this is within that week after the deadline. And then you will have to fix that application and resubmit before the end of that week, or else your application will get disqualified. So triple check, quadruple check the numbers, make sure everything is correct before submitting. And I like to triple check in every layer. So I'm going to pause the video right here to quadruple check my numbers and then input it here, and we'll be right back. All right, I'm back and I've quadruple checked all my numbers, and the total expenses came out to be $5,365 since it's under SEMAC's max grant request. So the SEMAC grant request matches that exact number. All right, so the way I got to that number was, first of all, I triple check and calculated these numbers, make sure that the subtotal reflect all of these numbers in each categories. And then I went back up here and I just started adding up these subtotals. And then I went all the way down and then I redo everything, make sure that the numbers are correct. So we have the correct number here. I just want to quickly mention that the example that we have is under that maximum grant request amount. In the last video, or the video after this, we'll talk more about that scenario if the total expense that you have for your project goes way beyond the actual maximum SEMAC grant request number. So keep that in mind if you're actually building this worksheet and then your total expenses are way beyond the SEMAC grant request, just to refer to the last video to look at how that would look like. Okay. At this point, we've worked through each of the major budget categories and prepare your spending plan worksheet. Before moving on, review your worksheet one final time. Make sure that it tells that story. Make sure your calculations are all correct, your totals have been added accurately, and each category supports the project you've described throughout your application. As we discussed earlier, your spending plan should tell the same story as the rest of your application. A reviewer should be able to move between your narrative and your budget without wondering where an expense came from or how a project activity will be accomplished. Once you're satisfied with your worksheet, you're ready for the next step. In the next video, we'll transfer everything we've prepared into the application form, complete the remaining budget question, and click that submit button. Alright, so we're at the end of this video, and you should have a much better understanding of the whole budget section, and hopefully you also have a completed spending plan worksheet ready to transfer to the application form. If you have any questions while preparing your spending plan or any questions about this grant program, please don't hesitate to reach out. Again, I'm Desmond Anabrang, Grant Programs Manager here at Southeastern Minnesota Arts Council. You can email me at staff@semac.org or call me at 507-281-4848. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.